that this phrase is highly misleading because the translation, as it were, of science into such measures is affected by a number of challenges and uncertainties, the extent of which has often been underestimated. And my strategy is to compare measures against the coronavirus pandemic to other policy measures, especially measures related to climate change and the MMR vaccination, and to argue that these uncertainties are significantly higher in the case of the former than in the latter. Okay, I shall distinguish 4 types of uncertainties that I take to be essential. Presumably this is not an exhaustive typology, but I think that these are at least very important ones. One more thing to note before we begin is that these are uncertainties that are particularly relevant from the perspective of lay people. The idea is that when lay people form their opinions or make decisions, they should take these types of uncertainties into considerations. And I mean, in a sense, when it comes to COVID, pretty much everyone is a layperson, not just policymakers or journalists, but also everyone else, because the situation is so complex. So even if you are an expert on some aspect of the present situation, there are extremely many other aspects about which you are a layperson. So let's start with uncertainty about something I call truth indicators. The starting point of this paper was a kind of epistemic irritation that I've experienced since the pandemic began in March 2020. What I found disturbing at the beginning of the pandemic was the high level of confidence that many politicians or journalists seem to have about many assumptions about COVID-19. I mean, they did talk about uncertainty, but at the same time, they often behaved as though they just knew what to do in response to it. As early as March 2020, there were frequent claims that there was a scientific consensus regarding various propositions about COVID. For example, in Germany, many media or so-called fact checkers gave the impression that the scientific community was in agreement regarding, for example, the precise dangerousness of the virus, or that or the proposition that a lockdown was an effective and necessary means to combat the pandemic. A well-known German climatologist, Stefan Rahmstorff, published a piece in which he compared the debate on COVID with that on climate change, and argued that in both cases we observe more or less identical forms of science denial. And I found this disturbing, to say the least, because in fact, there seem to be obvious differences between those who questioned certain claims about the dangers of COVID-19 or the effectiveness of lockdowns in March 2020, and those who denied the existence of man-made climate change. Okay, so what happens in general when policymakers, the public or lay people generally defer to science and come to conclude that a certain proposition is true? Very roughly and schematic, I think here's what's going on. Suppose that lay people are interested in the truth of a certain proposition. For example, whether there is a man-made climate change or whether the MMR vaccine causes autism. In these cases, the truth value of P is not immediately transparent to lay people. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to defer to the experts at all. It's what Erving Goldman called an esoteric proposition. What is rational for lay people to do in such situation is typically to use the consensus in the community of climatologists or the community of vaccinologists regarding P as an indicator of the truth of P. More generally, we could say, more generally, because a consensus is not the only possible fact, We could say that lay people use certain broadly sociological facts about certain scientific communities as truth indicators of certain propositions. And the assumption is that if P were false, there wouldn't be a consensus in the relevant scientific community that P is true. And therefore, it can be used as a truth indicator. Now, that the truth indicative fact, that there is a consensus, that this fact really obtains need not be perfectly transparent either. To lay people who are not acquainted with the research practices in a certain scientific community, it need not be clear at all whether there is a consensus in that community about a certain proposition. So they need, again, methods to determine whether the truth indicative facts really obtain. For example, they could refer to surveys among scientists, or meta studies, or guidelines, or other methods. Okay, so this is very roughly what I think goes on when lay people defer to scientific communities. There would be much more to say about this, and I do this in a monograph I'm writing about deferring to what I call plural epistemic authorities. But I hope that this brief sketch gives you at least a rough impression. So now let us apply this picture to propositions relevant to COVID-19, such as the proposition that so and so many people will die from COVID-19 if no countermeasures are taken, or the proposition that lockdowns will slow the spread of the pandemic to such an extent. And the first thing to note is that looking back to March 2020, there was no consensus among epidemiologists or virologists regarding these propositions. Even today, there is no scientific consensus yet about many relevant propositions. Here is my definition of what we typically mean when we speak of a scientific consensus. There is a consensus regarding P in the scientific community C, if and only if the vast majority, but not necessarily all members of C agree in their judgment regarding P. There has been an extensive debate regarding P in C. The vast majority, but not necessarily all members of C consider this debate to be closed for the time being. And there is common knowledge in C that these conditions are met. And I think this is what we typically mean when we speak of a scientific consensus, or at least something close to that. Now, when it comes to many propositions about COVID-19, it's not the case that the vast majority of the relevant experts agree in their judgments. I mean, there are such propositions. Most experts agree that there is a virus that causes COVID-19 and that it has certain properties qua being a virus, but with regard to many other propositions, there is no consensus. And of course, it's also not the case that in March 2020 there had been an extensive debate about these propositions. The virus had only been known for a few weeks, so actually none of the conditions are met. And in contrast, with regard to man-made climate change or the risks of MMR vaccination, there has been a decades-long debate. And after that debate, or as a result of that debate, most experts agree in their judgment now. Okay, now you might argue that policymakers could not wait until the emergence of a scientific consensus. They had to decide within days, not decades. And in response to this argument, I would like to point out two things. Of course, it's true that decisions had to be made quickly. Nevertheless, it was and is still misguiding and dangerous to assume the existence of a scientific consensus that does not exist. And as I mentioned, this has happened frequently in the past year. One reason why this is misguiding and dangerous is that the epistemic standards of dealing with dissenting voices are very different, depending on whether the dissent is directed against a well-established consensus or not. While arguably dissent about the existence of man-made climate change can rightly be dismissed as science denial and need not be taken very seriously, dissent about COVID-19 should not be discredited, but welcomed, namely for the many reasons that scientific pluralists have long put forward. And my second reply is the following. Let's consider again my scheme. Certainly the fact that there is a scientific consensus about P is not the only possible fact about C that laypeople could use as a truth indicator. For example, laypeople could also use the fact that a simple majority of C's members believe P as an indicator of the truth of P. The problem is that presumably the truth indicative power, as we could call it, of this fact is much lower than that of a scientific consensus. It obviously makes a difference whether, say, 60% of the community's members believe a proposition after a debate of a few weeks, or whether a large majority agree after decades of debate. Of course, this is not to say that there is a guarantee that P is true if there is a consensus. Even if there is a consensus, we should always be prepared to say that it has been reached in an epistemically problematic way, or that it is not knowledge-based as Boas Miller has called it. And even if it has reached in an epistemically virtuous way, there is no guarantee that the proposition is true, because human beings, including scientists, are always fallible. And this is something we can learn from the history of science. Nevertheless, it's probably fair to say in general that the truth indicating power of a scientific consensus is typically quite high. And if, on the other hand, there's merely a simple majority of a community's members who believe P, then one can also use this as a truth indicator, but this is associated with much greater uncertainty. So this is the first type of uncertainty that I would like to distinguish. And the second type concerns the determination of the truth indicative facts themselves. The question is, how should one actually know that in community C, there is really a simple majority of members who believe that P is true, or a consensus, or whatever the fact F is? Typically, the existence of a scientific consensus is transparent for the experts themselves. This is a corollary of condition 4 of my consensus definition. And I think it can also be determined relatively reliably by interested lay people, for example, by recourse to relevant textbooks, guidelines, etc. But how do you determine majorities when there are no surveys or guidelines or textbooks or meta studies yet? One idea could be that perhaps the media presence of the experts gives a certain impression of the majority situation. Suppose that a majority of experts visible in public claim that P is the case. But can we then conclude that a majority of all members of C, that is, including those not visible in the media, believe that P is the case? That would be, it seems to me that would be a very uncertain conclusion. It would be valid only if one were justified in assuming that the set of experts visible in the public is a representative subset of all relevant experts. But there are reasons to be skeptical about whether this is so. One reason is that those experts that challenge certain assumptions, for example, regarding the effectiveness of lockdowns or the mortality rate of COVID-19, have often had good reasons to fear being dismissed, for example, as science denialists. I have mentioned this before. And as a consequence, many of them will remain silent. I already said that it's dangerous when dissenters regarding COVID are compared to dissenters about climate change. And here's another reason why. If dissenters have to fear being discredited if they express their opinions publicly, then many of them will remain silent, which in turn distorts the picture the public gets of the scientific majority situation. But then the whole enterprise of deferring to the experts is in danger of becoming pointless. So far, I have focused on individual empirical propositions and how lay people can determine their truth values. However, when it comes to justifying policy measures like lockdowns, we face further complications. One of them arises from the fact that the empirical situation is enormously complex. For the justification of a lockdown, not individual propositions, but an immeasurable number of different propositions have to be considered. That's because lockdowns have so many different impacts and side effects, economic, social, medical effects, and so on, some of which insignificant, others devastating. And in this context, we face another higher order type of uncertainty, an uncertainty that arises from the fact that it's not even completely clear which propositions are relevant and which questions should be asked and to whom, to which scientific community. To give you just one little example, a recent study found a substantial increase in myopia in children in 2020 due to more frequent exposure to screens and less outdoor exercise during the lockdowns. I doubt that many policymakers were aware of this potential impact of lockdowns when they first implemented them in the spring 2020. This is, of course, only one minor example. There will be many more, and many effects and side effects of the lockdowns will still not, we will still not be aware of even today. And the previous point concerned the empirical complexity, that is the many different empirical propositions that are relevant to justifying policy measures such as lockdowns. One last point that I want to stress is this. Even if all relevant empirical propositions were known, and moreover their truth values were known, it would still not be clear which policy measures should be taken. And the reason is that policies cannot, in principle, be justified by scientific facts alone. Norms and values inevitably enter the decision-making process. So, for example, when the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, officially announced in December 2020 that, quote, from a scientific point of view, it is absolutely imperative to quickly and drastically reduce the number of new infections by means of a hard lockdown, unquote. It was rightly criticized for ignoring the boundary between empirical science and policy. And policies can and often should be informed by scientific evidence, but to assume that they are the direct consequences of research findings amounts to something of an expertocratic or a naturalistic fallacy. When justifying a lockdown, policymakers have to consider the various empirical consequences of lockdowns, those of alternative measures, and the consequences of an uncontrolled pandemic. But they also need to evaluate them. And they need to come to an overall value judgment whether the benefits of a lockdown exceeds its costs. and whether it has the best benefit-cost ratio among all alternative among all alternatives. The problem is that it is often unclear which values and norms are relevant and how they should be weighed against one another. And this is what I call normative uncertainty. For example, how should the economic costs of a lockdown be evaluated against its medical benefits? There's no straightforward answer to this question, not least because different people can prioritize different values differently. To be sure, we also observe the existence of normative uncertainty in the context of other issues, for example, the climate change debate. However, there is again a disanalogy between COVID and climate change or the MMR vaccination. The debates on these latter issues have not only resulted in scientific consensus on relevant empirical questions, but have also contributed to a clarification of relevant non-empirical questions. Not all of these questions have been conclusively answered, but lawyers, ethicists, decision theorists, and other experts on normative issues, if there is such a kind of expertise, as well as policymakers and the general public, have at least had plenty of time to delve into the relevant empirical results, identify normative problems, develop possible solutions to them, and carefully consider their pros and cons. And this can hardly be said with regard to COVID-19. So to sum up, I've distinguished 4 types of uncertainty challenging the translation of science into policy measures: uncertainty about the strength of potential truth indicators, uncertainty about whether the truth indicators really obtain, then higher order uncertainty about which propositions are relevant at all, and normative uncertainty. In general, awareness of these types of uncertainty has seemed to be low during the corona pandemic on the part of many policymakers, as well as journalists and other stakeholders. The objective degree of justification for many policy measures has often been much lower than policymakers, journalists, and other actors seem to have assumed. Many of these actors can therefore be accused of overconfidence, a lack of intellectual humility, and an insufficient willingness to engage in dialogue with critics and dissenters.